Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the third video in the Help How Do I Quilt It Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. So far, we've learned some great machine quilting designs for chevron blocks and snowball blocks. In this video, we're going to learn some of my favorite quilting designs for log cabin blocks. I'm going to show you how to quilt them on a sewing machine and a long arm, and tell you how you can get those free quilting diagrams. So, let's get to it. There are many log cabin variations, but they usually start with a center square with strips of fabric that work around the outside. And usually the fabrics on one side are lighter than the other. This is what allows that block to come together to make some really cool secondary designs in our quilt patterns. The fact that there are so many log cabin variations is the reason why they can be so hard to quilt. The strips might all be the same size, or they might not. The center square might be larger or smaller. The fabrics might be scrappy or monochromatic, and the list goes on and on. And that's why it's so hard to answer that help, how do I quilt it question. But in this video, I'm going to show you several different designs for quilting log cabin blocks and give you suggestions on where to actually use them on your quilts. During this video and the next one, I'll be quilting in these log cabin blocks that are on the exclusive panel I designed for this class. For simplicity's sake, I designed the blocks so that they're symmetrical on both sides and that the strips are all the same. Plus, both sides of the block have different color fabrics, which will help mimic the experience of quilting on an actual log cabin block. Before we get started, I just want to take a quick moment to talk about the designs that we're going to be learning in the next two videos. I've included designs that are more simple and basic in how they come together, as well as other designs that take a little bit more time to develop. Not every design is for every quilter, and that's okay. My hope is that you'll watch the video and you'll find a couple of designs that you like and want to use on your quilts. This first design uses echoing to highlight the individual pieces of the log cabin block. I think echoing is so amazing because it almost resembles how these blocks might have been hand quilted back in the day. Echoing is just quilting a line a set distance away from a seam to really highlight it and show it off. Normally, each section of that block would have its own echo lines, and we'll see that again here in just a moment. But for this design, we're going to change it up a bit so that we don't have any starts and stops. Think of it almost like a big square spiral. From a distance, it almost looks like traditional echoing, but it's not. I'm going to start by quilting that center square with the basic continuous curve design, with a line that curves from point to point, returning back to the starting point. Of course, you can quilt whatever you want in this area. The main idea is just to fill it in. Now I'm ready to start adding my echoing around the outside. So I'm going to travel along the seam for about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to start echoing that center square, working my way around all four sides of that square. Since I'm using the edge of the block as a guide, I don't have to do any marking. I'm just quilting the echo line so that it's about 1/4 inch away from the edge. Once I get near the beginning of my echo, I'm going to keep going until I hit the next seam, and I'm going to start echoing that. I'm basically using that seam as a guide for my lines. Now, when quilting this on a sewing machine, you can freehand it like I'm doing here, or you can use your ruler. Either one is fine. I've gotten close to my starting point again, but I'm going to keep going until I'm on the other side of that seam and do the same thing, echoing my way around. This is perfect for blocks that are made with busier fabrics, or where you want each block to kind of stand alone. For instance, in a quilt pattern where the blocks don't make a secondary pattern. And since I'm using the seams of my block as a guide, if I had a log cabin block that maybe had smaller strips on one side, the echoing would still fit that perfectly. And I'm just going to keep going round and around and around until that whole block is echoed. For this design, I'm using about 1/4 inch spacing. I'm doing that because I can run the edge of my foot along that seam, and it's going to give me that consistent spacing. You can make the spacing more or less, really depending on what you're going for. And if I have a block that maybe has more strips on one side than the other, if I get to a point where I still have some unquilted, I'll just travel along the edge and add enough lines to fill it in. For this design, if you want to quilt it so that it adds a little bit of subtle contrast to your quilting, when you're on one side of the block, you can quilt straight lines, and then when you cross over into the other, you can add wavy lines. It's nice and subtle, nothing too crazy or over the top, but it does help highlight the fact that there's two different colors of fabric on that block. Not only is it not any more difficult to quilt, it's just going to give it a subtle bit of contrast and really help show off the two sides of that block. If you find that quilting in one direction is a little bit easier than the other, don't forget you can always rotate that quilt to make it easy for you. It's a perfect example that changing up just one small thing of your quilting can give a big impact to your quilt. Whether you quilt straight echo lines or throw in some wavy bits here and there, this design's really going to highlight your individual blocks. Not every block needs over-the-top quilting. even though that is kind of how I like to quilt. Instead, we can use some diagonal lines and a curvy texture to add beautiful contrast to our quilt block. I'm going to use the corners of my blocks as reference points, quilting diagonal lines that go from one to the next, then travel along the edges of my block so I can move on to the next one. So starting with that center square, I'm going to fill it in first. You can fill this in with whatever design you feel like quilting. I'm just going to stick with that same continuous curve since we've already kind of seen it. Then from that corner, I'm going to quilt a diagonal line to the outer corner of the next ring. For this, you could use a ruler or you could freehand it, whatever feels more comfortable to you. Then from that point, back to the opposite corner from where I started. And there I have my first V. Now I'm going to do the same in the next row of strips, but I'm going to use traveling to get me to that point so that I can then quilt my diagonal line from one side to the next. If you wanted to, you could stitch in the seams between your rows if you'd like, or you can leave that part out. It's totally up to you. While you can use this design in blocks of all sizes, the bigger the block gets, the longer those diagonal lines will be. So it really just kind of depends on your comfort level. And then on to the next side. It's just a fun way to kind of give it a geometric look and to highlight the different rows of fabrics. And now that I'm finished with that side, I'm going to fill in the rest of the other side with a curvier design such as swirls. Of course, you could go with any design that you feel comfortable quilting, just something to fill that in and make it look nice. I especially love quilting this design in blocks where maybe one side of the block is made of busier fabrics and you're not going to see the quilting as much anyway. I can use that dot-to-dot design in the more tonal fabrics, and then in those busier prints, just go for an all-over design. It'll give it a lovely texture, it'll contrast with that dot-to-dot, but be quick and easier to quilt. As you're quilting this, or really any design on a sewing machine, remember that you have most control when your hands are on either side of the foot. So as you're filling in those areas, make sure you take time to reposition your hands. It's going to give you the most control of your quilting and give you the best results. And just continue quilting until that whole side of your block is finished. This is a great way to add lovely texture with a little bit of contrast to your log cabin blocks. Now, let's see what it looks like to quilt this design on a long arm. I've already filled in the center square, and now it's time to start quilting the diagonal lines. Quilting this design on a long arm is not much different. The main difference is I'm definitely going to use a ruler for those diagonal lines since they're difficult to quilt on a long arm without one. But this time I am going to stitch in the seam between the strips before continuing on with the design. Of course, this is totally optional. Then I'll quilt a diagonal line from this corner to the outer corner and then on to the other side. And then once that's done, it's time to fill in the other side of the block. And I'm also going to stitch down any unquilted seams as I go. I'm using swirls again since they are my favorite, but like I've already said, any filler design will work here. Now, if the log cabin block that you're working on has a center square that's a little bit smaller, you can just quilt that with the same filler design. No matter what machine you're using to quilt this design, whether it's a sewing machine or a long arm, filling in an irregular area like this can be a little tricky. I'm just going to make sure that I use echoing to help fill in any gaps and then use it to move on. And if I find myself getting stuck at a certain point, I'll just travel along the edge to get out or add another echo line. Really, the most important thing is that once you're finished, there's no gaps in the quilting. And I just love how this design will help highlight the two different sides of your block, giving a nice texture to maybe busier fabrics, and then really showing off your beautiful piecing in the other side. To change up the look of that dot-to-dot quilting, you can actually use different dots as your reference points. The result is a slightly different looking design that highlights a different portion of your block. In the first design, we used echoing to highlight the whole block. But with this design, we're going to use echoing to highlight the individual sections to make them stand out. For such a simple shape, echoing sure does have a lot of power. It's a great way to separate sections of the quilt that maybe look similar and also helps highlight whatever you put inside of it. And the good news is it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to echo one side of my center square, then I'll travel along the edge of the block to get to the other side and do the same, echoing from one side to the next. It's that traveling that allows those echo lines to look like they're going behind the other piece. And from this point, I could either add a filler on the inside of my spacing, I could add another line, or I can go right on to echoing the next side of my block. I'm just going to stitch along this seam real quick, Get to my next section, and I'll travel along the edge just about 1/4 of an inch and then echo the side of that block. And I know I've already said this, but I love to use the 1/4 inch spacing because I can run the edge of the foot along that seam, but you can experiment with different spacing to find what's comfortable for you. It's just an all-around great way to show off the different pieces of your log cabin block. For wider strips or for more of a custom look, I can add a filler on the inside of that, and we're going to see what that looks like on a long arm. On the long arm, I'm going to use a ruler to quilt those echo lines by echoing one side of the block, traveling on the edge to get to the other side, and then doing the same. Once I'm finished, I have a little bit of area in between those lines, and to highlight them, I'm going to add a different design, such as a wishbone. I like the wishbones because it really fits in this area, but you can use any kind of filler that you like. Once I get to the corner, I'm just going to quilt one of those wishbones so that it goes on the diagonal, and then wraps around and continues on the other side. This is also a great way to help separate that filler design from the rest of the quilting to really make it pop. And like I've already said, you don't have to echo both sides of the block. For smaller blocks, or if you don't love the echoing, you could just echo one side and then use your filler. Like I said, it's just a great, easy way to give your quilting a little bit more of a custom look. And you don't have to just use the echoing within the strips. If your log cabin has a larger square, you can continue the echoing inside of it just to add a little bit more detail to that point. So here I'm just going to add some echo lines, almost as if it was a pieced strip as well. And then I'll echo it just like I did the strips and fill it in. Not only does it make bigger blocks easier to manage, it really adds some more detail to your beautiful quilting. And then inside the remaining area, you can quilt any design you want. Here I'm just doing a continuous curve. On the other side of the block, we can still use that same echoing idea, but change up the straight line and quilt a bracket instead. This is perfect if you struggle with quilting straight lines or you just want a more curvier, pointy look to your quilting. So starting along the edge of my fabric, I'm going to quilt a line that curves out to a point and swoops back to the other side to make that bracket shape. It has a little bit of curve, a little bit of point. So I'm going to repeat that, continuing to quilt my brackets until I reach that inner border corner. And here I've kind of ended on a partial bracket. That's totally fine. I'm just going to stop and then work my way along the other side of the block, quilting those same bracket shapes. Turning the corner doesn't have to be difficult, and you don't have to overthink it. Just get to that point and wrap it around. If you want to make sure that bracket lands perfectly on that corner, you could mark them out beforehand, but I just kind of wing it. And I'm just going to keep echoing this bracket shape to fill in that area by swinging out and then just echoing that previously quilted line. Doesn't have to be a perfect echo. I'm just trying to make that same basic shape. And again, I'm using that 1/4 inch spacing because that's what I like to do, but you can spread them further out if you'd like. And I can just continue adding rows of those to fill it in. Now if you're struggling with this shape or it's just not quite clicking right, you can check out my free quilting diagrams for this video. And not only does this shape give your quilting a bit of a curvy, pointier look, it might be easier to quilt in longer blocks than your straight line echoing. Now in this example, I've quilted rows of brackets so that they fill in that strip, but if you want to do it slightly different, you could quilt a couple rows and add a filler, and let me show you what that looks like on the long arm. Just like we saw on the sewing machine, I'm going to quilt the bracket shape along the edge of that strip. Once I reach that inner border corner, I'm going to continue quilting those bracket shapes along the next side of the block until I reach the edge. And just for fun, I'm going to quilt another line of brackets. I'm kind of trying to echo the previously quilted line, but I'm not worried too much if it's not perfect. Now as you're quilting these bracket shapes, yours might be taller or shorter, they might be narrower or wider. Try not to worry so much about the exact size. Just try to get into a quilting rhythm so that you can keep them consistent in size. Then once I've decided I'm done quilting my rows of brackets, I'm going to fill in the remaining space with a different design, such as wishbones. Of course, this is totally optional. I could add more echo lines or I could do a different kind of design altogether, but I just love that kind of curvy wishbone next to that bracket shape. One of the difficulties of quilting this design on a long arm is I have to get comfortable quilting it in all different directions. Unlike a sewing machine, I can't easily change the orientation of the quilt. So if you're struggling with quilting it in a certain direction, for instance left to right or right to left, just know it takes a little bit of practice and eventually it will click. Once I get to the corner, I'm going to try to quilt them so that they pivot around that inner border corner. I'm going to try to keep it as even as I can, but I know that even if it looks a little weird in the corner, it's going to be fine. Once I'm done, all I'm going to see are those beautiful bracket shapes and that curvy, beautiful look of the wishbones. I'm probably going to use this technique in slightly larger blocks since I need room to quilt that wishbone. But whether you quilt rows of brackets or you quilt a couple and add a beautiful texture with wishbone designs, this technique can be used on many different kinds of log cabin blocks. If that bracket shape is throwing you for a loop, you can switch it out with an arc. It's going to give you that same basic kind of look, but you might find it a little bit easier to quilt. I think the arcs give it a nice kind of scalloped look. It's sweet and adorable, and plus it's fun to quilt. And who says you have to just pick one design? You can try variations of all these designs within the same block to get a beautiful custom look that's really a lot of fun to quilt. So whether you go for straight line echoes, a curvier bracket kind of shape, or go with arcs and a filler design, this is going to be a great way to quilt your log cabin blocks. Very rarely do you see a quilt with just one log cabin block. Now those things are like ants. When you see one, you can be sure that there's more. When the log cabin blocks come together to make those secondary designs, the quilting designs we use do as well. This is so amazing because even the most basic looking design can look elaborate when used in consecutive blocks. For an example of this, I'm going to show you serpentine lines on a long arm quilting machine. I'm going to fill in the outer sections of the log cabin blocks here with the serpentine line design. Starting from the outer corner, I'm going to quilt a teardrop shape that goes out and comes back. And then I'll work along one side of the block, quilting those curvy serpentine lines that go from side to side. Now we saw how to quilt the serpentine lines in the first video of the series, and we learned how to quilt them in a chevron block. This is going to be the same, just a little bit of a longer area. If you haven't already watched that video, be sure to check it out. So I'm going to keep quilting these serpentine lines until I reach the end of my area. Once I get to the end, I'm going to travel back along the edge to get to the teardrop so I can continue quilting along the other side. Now I'm going to do the same on the other side of the block, quilting those serpentine lines along the edge. I like quilting along the seams as a way to maneuver around the area, but of course you could tie off and start a new line of quilting if that's what you prefer. But if you're struggling with the serpentine line design, I have some free quilting diagrams that you can download and print out. Sometimes tracing along that shape over and over again will help it click, and then you'll be able to quilt it. Once I get to the edge, I'm going to travel back to the teardrop. Now once I'm done with this block, it's time to move on to the outer section of the next block, and this is where we're going to see that cool secondary pattern come together. I'm quilting the teardrop shape just like before, and then I'm going to start quilting my serpentine lines along the side of the block. Except I'm going to quilt them so that they're going in the opposite direction of the previous ones. This kind of helps group those serpentine lines together to form what looks like a bigger motif and really helps give it that beautiful look. And if serpentine lines aren't really your thing, you can try it with feathers as well. I love to use this technique of creating secondary designs for log cabin blocks that are grouped together or ones that make a secondary design. It just helps kind of enhance the effect of the quilt pattern, and plus it looks amazing. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the challenge, fill in the log cabin blocks highlighted in red. Try the designs we've learned in this video, or come up with your own variations. And as always, I've put together a free downloadable quilting diagram sheet so that you can be successful with the designs we've learned in this video. And I'll be back next week with even more designs for log cabin blocks. So until then everyone, happy quilting.